Hello everyone, and welcome to the first session of the SunoikisisDC Classics seminar, spring term. And today we have our first session. As I said, welcome everybody. We will be talking about object description and process in EpiDoc. And we are very lucky to have Gabriel Bodard from the University of London and Martina Filosa from the University of Köln. And hopefully Usama will join us as well. And the other speaker from Ain Shams University. He had some technical issues, but he's with us in spirit, and maybe he will be able to join us later. Just a quick reminder for everybody that you should have the comments text, like comments box on the right of the screen, so you should be able to leave comments during the session. And we are always very happy to hear from anyone watching. If you want to let us know from where you're watching, or as I said, if you have any questions, we will bring those up at the end of the session and we will have a longer discussion. So I think that's all for me. I am giving now the turn to speak to Gabi. Yeah, there you go.
Great. Thank you, Paula. That's great. Yeah, so I'll start by saying just a couple of words about what unpacking that title a little bit, and then I'll be talking a little bit more detail about what is EpiDoc. What do we mean by this? EpiDoc is an encoding scheme for recording, studying, and publishing inscriptions, epigraphic texts, or ancient texts generally. And I will talk a little bit more about this fairly quickly in general terms of what EpiDoc is and where it's come from. But I think before that, I want to I'll maybe ask a slightly more basic question, which is, what is epigraphy? Both in its conventional sense and in the slightly broader sense in which we sometimes find ourselves using it. So in simple terms, it's the study of texts that are written on durable objects from the ancient world or from any other historical period for that matter. Normally texts that are written for public display, although not always. It's often contrasted with papyrology, which is often deals with objects that are written with texts that are written on more ephemeral objects like papyrus or paper or other things, potsherds, writing tablets, etc., and that would tend to be not always, but tend to be for slightly more ephemeral and temporary and private purposes. The broader sense in which we're using this is anything written in the ancient world, that is, the preprint world, let's say, on any kind of object. I've said, and this is something that Martina will correct me for. I said it's the study of texts written on, but the other way of describing it is it's the study of objects with text written on them, right? Which is quite an important distinction. Are we studying the texts that just happen to be written on objects, or are we studying objects that just happen to have text on them? And it's a bit of both, but the bias has tended to be to study of the text and ignoring the objects. And that's part of what we're talking today, is pay more attention to the objects and what comes out of that. So I've just got on the screen here an example of an inscription. It's a very typical Greek inscription. It's a large piece of marble. It looks yellow because of the way in which it was photographed. This is from about, I think, the 2nd or 3rd century CE. I don't remember the exact inscription, and it has very, very clear and easy to read Greek characters carved in it, and they've clearly survived for almost 2,000 years with almost no damage almost no lack of legibility, some damage to the object. Other examples, these are some even older texts written in Egyptian hieroglyphics. This is a Latin inscription in a slightly different form. The text there, as I think, are painted. I mean, they're clearly painted, but I think they're just painted rather than inscribed and then painted. And another example, this is an inscription in the sense that it's an object that has had writing engraved into the surface, but it's a potsherd, it's an ostracon, and so it might be more likely to be studied by a papyrologist than an epigraphist. But it's in the broader sense, it's an ancient object with text written on it. These texts have been an important source. So all these kinds of texts have been an important source for history for almost as long as they've been written. People in 5th century BC were looking at 6th century BC or even earlier 5th century BC inscriptions as evidence of politics and history from earlier in that century. So looking at treaties between other states, looking at the outcomes of battles, they've been cited by historians such as Thucydides and Herodotus. So they've clearly been looking at inscriptions. And so throughout history, throughout ancient, medieval, early modern and modern history, historians have looked at inscribed texts and texts on papyrus, texts on seals and other things as part of the historical record. And so one of the things that they've needed to do is to publish those texts. And this is where I'll briefly talk about something called the Leiden system. Throughout this historical period, and particularly through the early modern period, when people publish the texts from inscriptions, they feel the need to be quite careful about letting you know what is actually on the stone now or on the support, and what has been damaged since it was written, but we can extrapolate or restore or in some way repair from our editorial knowledge. And so they've tended to use some sorts of brackets and other sigilla to say these are the parts that are on the stone, these are the parts that are not. They might put the text in brackets, they might underline the text, they might do other things to the text, put it in a different font, in a different color, a different kind of writing, uppercase as opposed to lowercase, or whatever. And this has gradually become more systematized up to the 19th century. And in 1931, it was actually papyrologists who started really systematized this with something called the Leiden system. That was the Leiden convention. What we see here is a text in Leiden. The bits that have brackets around them are bits that are not really on the stone, that someone has restored this. The ones, different brackets mean different things. Other kinds of sigilla also have various meanings, and there are other things which were not part of the text on the stone, such as that hyphen at a non-word breaking line break, and the line number in the left margin, and punctuation and spaces between words, and the distinction between upper and lowercase letters, and the presence of accents and breathing marks on the Greek. All of those sorts of things are things that are part of the standard scheme for transcribing epigraphic, papyrological, and other primary source texts like this. And this was very much systematized from 1931. And this is a simplification of that scheme. It shows that brackets mean certain things, different kinds of brackets mean different things, and other symbols mean things in there. I'm not going into this in any detail because we're going to talk more about the object than about the text today. So the next thing that comes along relatively soon after 1931, in the scale of the historical sweep that we've been talking about, this only 70 years later, in about 2000, along comes this thing called EpiDoc, which is basically taking the Leiden system and keeping the distinctions of the Leiden system, but mapping them to a computer-readable HTML language, which is now XML, which is an existing system called TEI, and also taking the fields of some of the main epigraphic and papyrological databases and mapping those to TEI XML as well, so that you can record all those exactly the same distinctions that epigraphers and papyrologists and historians have thought were important for all this time, and also process them and deal with them and action them computationally. So the EpiDoc tool set and set of guidelines involves these sorts of items. So there's a set of guidelines, instructions on what to do if you want to put your inscriptions or other texts into EpiDoc XML, a set of reference style sheets which will transform your XML into a web view, into PDFs for printing, into indexes, into other kinds of output, a schema, which is a tool, a digital tool that helps to validate and constrain the XML that you might write to check that what you're doing is reasonable and according to the rules set out in these guidelines. The guidelines and the schema are basically the human readable and the machine readable version of the same thing. There's an EpiDoc publication tool called FS. There's a training program which has come out of all this, and there's many YouTube videos. If you Google for EpiDoc, you'll find many of them. And there are also a bunch of other third-party tools that are not created by and maintained by the EpiDoc community itself, but that work on and with EpiDoc, including some of the things mentioned here. I've said that EpiDoc uses XML, and just to sort of point out, this is a sort of definition of XML from the point of view of EpiDoc. XML is plain text. It's Unicode text, so whatever script you're writing in, you can just include those characters in there. And you can open it in literally any software that can read text. But what it does have, it has these things called tags. Tags are distinguished by angle brackets, these angle brackets here. And so if we have here this string of text, angle bracket name, angle bracket Theodotos Palatinos, angle bracket / name, angle bracket, the parts in the angle brackets are the tags. So what we're saying is that Theodotos Palatinos is a name. Okay, and that's something which it's all still plain text, and I've only got those tags there in those angle brackets there in purple so that you can see them. That's not part of the XML language. It's all just plain text, and it can be processed therefore by lots and lots of different types of tool and software. And there's an opening tag. There's that slash before the closing tag, and you can have empty tags which have no content inside them or have an empty element like this, and you can also have attributes on the elements. Now, I'm not going to go into detail and define all of these rules of XML for this purpose. That would be something useful for us to do in the longer term, and in terms of the exercise, you'll want to look a little bit about these rules. So we'll leave these slides up for you to go back and look over them. A couple of important points. White space, which is any space or tab or line break character, obviously it matters whether or not there is line space. If I have a space in the middle of this string of characters, it means something different. Imperator and imperator mean two different things, and having a space before the name of an attribute or having the lack of a space there mean different things. This is not an attribute because there's no space there to say where it's just separated out, and spaces between or within elements also are meaningful and make a difference, as you would expect. But the reason it's worth laboring on that is that the type and amount of white space is not significant. So if I say imperator with a single space in between, or imperator with a line break in between, if I say p type equals new with one space or with 12 spaces, or even with 3 line breaks and 99 spaces, all of those mean exactly the same thing and will be treated in exactly the same way by any XML processing tool. This is something that's quite important to just keep an eye on when you're working in XML. There's also one thing worth knowing is there's such a thing as an XML comment. If you have this angle bracket beginning with then an exclamation point and 2 dashes and ending with 2 dashes before the closing angle bracket, this is text that will not be processed by anything that looks at your XML. It will be treated as if it isn't there. So it's a very useful way to leave a note to yourself or to someone else in the future, or to temporarily hide some code that you don't want to actually be processed. It doesn't have to be well formed. It doesn't have to be valid. It can be any characters can be inside those angle brackets. And this is the sort of summary of the 5 rules of what we mean by well formedness. If these 5 rules are not followed, then what you have is not XML. It's broken and cannot be processed. There's all sorts of other rules of validation which are defined by your schema, but these rules are absolutely essential. And again, I'll just leave these in the slides for you to go back and revise when you're trying that out in an exercise. And you can see if you find that your XML editor flags up an error, then that may be one of these rules may be the reason for that. So I said that that the Leiden system that we showed you a few minutes ago is what EpiDoc maps to precisely. So this is the list of the Leiden conventions on the left and the definitions of them here on the right, and this is their equivalents in EpiDoc XML. So you can see it's a lot more verbose than the Leiden. It's not human readable. You wouldn't want to have to look at this and read an inscription or papyrus with this layout. But it is much more machine readable because it is so unambiguous. It is so standardized. So it's much easier to explain what EpiDoc is and what XML is when we're talking about the text, but we're not primarily talking about the text today. What we want to talk about today is primarily the physical description and the history of the object on which this text stands. So we have things like physical description, locations, dates, the history of publication, and then the text and translation and commentary on that text, which are things that tend to often be focused on a lot more. These are two examples of editions of HText. So the parts of those editions that have the description. So the one on the top there is an inscription from Tripolitania. And the one below is a papyrus from Oxyrhynchus. Now, I haven't given you the text of the inscription or the papyrus. What we're interested in is the sorts of thing people say. And you can see these are relatively similar. They're very different projects, but they still have a similar subset of things that they talk about. They both talk about material. They both talk about find place. They both talk about date. A lot of the same sorts of things that appear in the two different editions. For this, we use part of the TEI, part of the EpiDoc schema, which is called the manuscript description module, and a typical manuscript. So this is an Old English manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, recorded using the manuscript description module, and this is a sort of fairly standard use of this in TEI XML. But as referred, as applied to an inscription, and I'll make that a little bit bigger by hiding us for a moment, so that's a little bit easier for you to see on YouTube. You have the manuscript description, which will have the identifier, the physical description, the hand description, the layout description, and then the history, which includes origin, date, provenance, and so forth. And these are exactly those features that you would usually record in an epigraphic or papyrological or sigillographic or numismatic edition. Went too far. So we have, yes, again, I'll leave these slides up there for you to sort of see. I won't discuss them in any detail. The manuscript identifier is what this object is called in the institution that holds it. The physical description, that's fairly self-explanatory. What is the material? How is the text on the material laid out? What does the handwriting look like? The history, things like when was this originally made, or when was it originally written on, which may or may not be the same thing. Where was it originally made, or where was it originally displayed? Where was it when it was found, hundreds or thousands of years later? Where is it now? Where have we put it in post-discovery? And this is just another sort of summary of that information, with a slightly different view. And there's a link if you go to the session page for this session, which is below the YouTube video. There is a quick reference document in PDF which has been made available for you to download, and this information from this slide is on that. Is on that PDF. This will be something that you can use when you're deciding how you want to record your chosen inscription or other text-bearing object in TEI XML. And that's where I want to stop, and I will hand over to Martina, who's going to now talk about all the stuff that I forgot to talk about, which is the object.
Thank you so much, Gabby, and thank you for this great introduction to EpiDoc and epigraphy. So now we will go a bit beyond that and just talk about other text-bearing objects. So what's as Gabby said at the very beginning, we will talk about epigraphy in the sense of object inscribed and not the text on those objects. So I would like to start by focusing on a quotation by Charlotte Roche a couple of years ago, and she was focusing on the fact that there has been undeniably a tendency for work in digital epigraphy to focus on the inscribed text on stone of the Greco-Roman world. So let's just keep in mind, inscribed text on stone of the Greco-Roman world. And now there's a very strong trend within the EpiDoc community to look beyond these boundaries. So, and what we are going to see today are a lot of inscribed objects, as you can see. And since I am a Byzantinist and a sigillographer by training, we will linger a bit on these objects. And for example, I don't know if you can spot anything known to you on this slide, but here we have seals, we have coins, we have Eucharistic bread stamps, we have weights, we have ingots, and also more coins, but not Byzantine. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to see what has been already done in terms of customization of EpiDoc for other text-bearing objects, what's in the works right now, and what can be done in the near future. So let's have a look at what has been done. So as Gabby already showed quickly before, we will talk about papyri, because it is the, let's say, the most mature and the most accomplished, if I can say so, customization of EpiDoc, and also because the metadata referring to the objects are very, very close to those regarding the inscriptions on stones. So of course we're talking about papyri.info, and I'm confident that you already know this site, this resource, and if you do not, you will find a link with an introduction in the session outline of this very session. Also because in many sessions in Sunoikisis, there has been a lot of talk about papyri.info, so I don't think that's very clever of me of linger on papyri.info at this point, but yeah. So just so that you know a couple of things about this resource, as Gabby already has explained before, regarding the birth, let's say, of EpiDoc. Also, in the case of papyri.info, there has been a migration from SGML to EpiDoc XML, also in order to ensure compatibility, accessibility, and also the reuse of data. It comprises two very interesting parts, that is the papyrological navigator and the papyrological editor. Without going into too much detail, the papyrological editor is a very interesting feature because it's, let's say, community sourced, where users can add new data or they can change existing data, and they can edit the text and the metadata using the EpiDoc syntax, using Leiden plus. Let's say, Leiden for those of you following us from the very beginning, Leiden clearly refers to the Leiden system, which has been extensively talked about by Gabriel a couple of minutes ago. And the plus is like the enhancement, the digital enhancement of it. So we're dealing here with both text and object on an EpiDoc level, but not for epigraphs, so not for inscriptions on stone, but rather for papyri. So may I ask one of you to mute yourself because there's a background noise? Cool, perfect. So let's go to our second step. So what's in the works? What are people working on at this age and time? So, of course, as I was mentioning before, due to my training, I had to talk about Byzantine seals, but not only Byzantine. That's why Byzantine is in brackets, so that you already have seen a seal in your career. This is how it looks like, and yes, it's a quite straightforward seal from the 11th century, and it bears a lot of information, as you can see in the caption. But why am I talking about seals? One of the, let's say, newest customization of EpiDoc, as far as text-bearing objects not inscribed in stones and not coming from the Greco-Roman world are concerned, is SigiDoc 1.0. So without going too much into detail, this is not a very new, let's say, resource, meaning that talks about having a digital edition of both text and metadata of Byzantine seals began almost 20 years ago, but it's just like a couple of years ago that this endeavor has started pretty much. And now it is developed at the University of Cologne, where I'm based, and at the Sorbonne University in Paris. So this is a customization of EpiDoc because the needs of people dealing with seals are different than the needs of the epigraphers, and I will explain in a minute why. So first of all, let's see what a customization, not only SigiDoc, but a customization of EpiDoc is actually made of. So first of all, we have a schema, and you already know what is a schema because Gabby just explained what it is, which is a clean subset of EpiDoc and of TI all schemas. So the schema of SigiDoc is pretty much so as everything that EpiDoc has, and added a couple of things more taken from the TI schema. Moreover, there's a template, so an addition structure, which looks like what Gabby showed before regarding the metadata. There are style sheets for HTML transformation. There's also a highly customized version of FS, EpiDoc Frontend Services, which already, once again, has been mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And there's also there are also guidelines, which are the, let's say, human-readable version of the schema, and a couple of things more that are not relevant to our purpose right now. So, but what? Let's go a step back. So let's just see what is a seal, in this case, a Byzantine seal, from an EpiDoc, from a SigiDoc, or from a data model point of view. So we have an object, we have a text, and we have an image. So let's go back 1 second here. As you can see, we have the object itself, we have the text, so what's inscribed, let's say, on the seal, and we also have a very nice iconography, in this case of the Archangel Michael. So We will not focus on the image and on the iconography in this moment, because it's a session per se, if I can say so. So we will just focus on object and text. So let's just analyze a bit what's the object in the text-bearing object definition. So as you can see here, you have what Gabby showed us a couple of minutes ago in terms of template. Here you have it as a graph. So we have the TI header and all the metadata that are relevant for the description of the object in its materiality. So we want to be focusing right now on the materiality of the object and not on what's written on it. So we also have to think that whenever these artifacts have been produced, they've been produced not, let's say, as reading devices, and I'm talking right now only for the second part of the presentation, because of course papyri and inscription on stone is another history. But for the object that we're talking about right now, so seals, coins, ingots, weights, and bread stamps, they have not been produced to be read, let's say, but they've been produced as objects. So in this case, seals, for example, they've been produced in order to sign some documents. And it's also important that a digital edition gives to this aspect of the object its own, let's say, importance, because the let's say printed edition very often tend to overlook the materiality of the object and just go straight to the text. Whereas, of course, it's important, let's say, if a seal is round, if a seal is oval, if it's 5 centimeter diameter, if it's just 2 centimeter diameter, it can say a lot about its history. And of course, we're all classicists, and we're all historians and philologists, and we should take into account these aspects whatsoever. So let's see here a very important thing, which sorry, I will go one slide back. So of course, what I've been showing here in this slide translates into very, very detailed metadata, and I'm not just talking about the edition of a seal, but also of an inscription, of a papyrus. So and all this metadata have to be very thorough in order to explain the materiality and the history of the object. Here I have listed all the fields that whoever of you has ever seen a epigraphical or a sigillographical printed edition will be let's say familiar with already. So these are all the fields that in a SigiDoc edition, so in a sigillographic edition, digital edition done with SigiDoc, all the fields that give us metadata regarding the materiality of the object. And for those of you who are already familiar with EpiDoc, you will find or better, not only with EpiDoc, but also with the, let's say, FS output of EpiDoc, you will see that there is quite a few things that have been added. But of course, this is bound to the type of object that we're talking about. So as you have seen in the previous slides, we're talking about mostly a round object with 2 faces, with 2 inscribed faces, and we can also talk about its dimensions because they're relevant, and also where it is positioned in comparison, let's say, in conjunction to the document that it was attached to, and do we have also alternative dating? Is for example, do we have the mention of a particular emperor, and so on and so forth? And wait, do I have? Can I? Yeah, I can point here. For example, we have some fields. That is, we also have some elements that, of course, are not relevant in epigraphy nor in papyrology, because they are actually elements which are relevant for numismatic. For example, if we have an overstrike, that is if the seal or if the coin has been struck twice, or the channel orientation. So a lot of information regarding the materiality of the object. And this has proven very difficult when we're doing, let's say, retro digitization of editions, of print editions, because all this information has been completely overlooked into in the print edition from the, let's say, from the 40 until a couple of years ago. So it's a very big job to do, but someone has to do that. So let's focus for a tiny bit on the text part of the text-bearing object. As you can see, the let's say this graph is quite straightforward. We added a couple of things, but it's not that relevant in this moment. But the most important thing is that different text-bearing objects very often have different editorial needs, both in terms of text and in terms of materiality. So, for example, as I was saying before, seals and coins, they have two inscribed faces, and having two inscribed faces mostly translates into having an inscription running across the faces, and so on and so forth. For example, there is also the question of seriality, the seriality of coins. So it is not very important what is written on the coin if it has been produced in thousands and thousands of exemplars. But what is actually relevant is its materiality. But these are all things that we should be discussing later in our roundtable. So I just want to give a couple of inputs. So what can be done? So having seen what has been done, having seen what we are doing right now with text-bearing objects which are not inscription and papyri, what can be done? And now all the objects that I showed you before on that very, very crowded slide come into play. So customizations, the customization that we let's say did going from the big umbrella of TI to EpiDoc, and then a smaller version of EpiDoc, let's say customized for seals, can also be applied to other smaller text-bearing objects. For example, Eucharistic bread stamps. As you can see here, we have an inscription, Jesus Christos Nika, and also a very distinctive form, because as you can see, as you can imagine, being a Eucharistic bread stamp, it had to be, let's say, pressed into the uncooked bread in order for it to be visible once cooked. So as we were saying before, so it's a nice lapsus that I had. These objects were not made to be read; they were made to be used. Same goes for ingots. As you can see here, there are three different, or better, they're the same. So we have three monograms reading Eparchos Polios, so like the prefect of the city. And again, this was not made to be read; this was made to be used. And also weights. Very interesting balance weight with a nice monogram, and very nice image on it. And once again, we go always back to the, let's say, holy trinity of image, text, and objects. So this very profound, let's say, relationship between these three parts on text-bearing objects is fundamental. And also coins. Coins should be taken here with a question mark or with a caveat, because there are already a lot of attempts and very, very well done for digital numismatics. We have the numisma.org consortium, which is pretty much based on RDF ontologies and linked open data. And you can see here, I put a couple of links here. So whenever you have your slides, you can just go and check it out for yourself. There's also the numismatic description schema, which is actually a codified XML schema, but it is not EpiDoc nor TEI. So there is no compatibility between the numisma schema and EpiDoc. However, I will not linger too much onto it, because during Sunoikisis, during 2020, there was a whole session on digital numismatics, and I urge you to go and check it out. I would be done so that perhaps we can discuss a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Martina. So this is a slightly change from the advertised program, because our colleague and collaborator Usama, with whom Martina and I have just written a paper on exactly the sorts of things we'll be talking about and will be talking about for the next 20 minutes, has been failed by his internet provider. So we're having to fill in for him, and because we haven't planned 20 minutes worth of slides to present this, what we're going to do instead is we're going to discuss some of the issues which we expect, and if he had been here, he would be talking about. And hopefully in the future he'll come along and tell us whether this was actually what he was going to say or not. So Martina's put up a list of some of the issues that we think are interesting there, and the three of us might maybe sort of take turns to riff off of these, or I don't know. Do you want to start, Martina, or shall I?
Sorry, I was muted. I can start if you want to. For example, we can start by the nice remark that you, Gabby, did before in your presentation that wasn't clear to me at all at the very beginning. So that even though like inscriptions on stones, let's say, and papyri are two completely different, let's say, media, the metadata that can be found in the editions are quite similar, if not the same. So I don't know, it's let's say it's more of a comment than a question, but we can perhaps elaborate on that a bit.
I think that is true, and that's something that has always struck me, that when we worked on papyri.info and we customized EpiDoc, which had previously only been used for inscriptions, we expected to have to do various customizations, and we ended up not having to customize anything at all. We built different software, we had a slightly different sort of set of data in it, but the customization in terms of, okay, this is how we do epigraphy, papyri is just slightly differently, there was nothing at all. It was all pretty much exactly the same. And that's partly, of course, because not just because we did an excellent job designing EpiDoc in the first place in the previous 10 years, but partly because both epigraphy and papyrology come out of the same academic traditions. They're both classicists, Greek and Roman historians primarily worked on these. And so, of course, they heavily influenced each other. And of course, they were very, very similar and very compatible in many ways. And there are slightly more differences if you start talking about people who study medieval manuscripts, for example, which on paper, no pun intended, might look closer to papyrology than to epigraphy, but actually ends up diverging from both. So it may be a disciplinary question. One thing that struck me from what you just said, and from what you said a little earlier, that that seals and some of the other kinds of objects you talked about were not designed as reading texts, unlike inscriptions and papyri. I think there's certainly been a certain amount for maybe not so much for papyri, but for inscriptions. There's been a lot of thought about how much inscriptions were actually designed to be read. I mean, they seem to be, right? I mean, there's large text written in monumental scale letters, which is clearly meant to be very easy to read. We're fairly sure from the material evidence that most ancient inscriptions were painted to make them even more visible, and so forth. And yet we see inscriptions that that are written on the inside of a building at an angle that if you were to actually be close enough to read it and to look at it, you would A, crick your neck, and B, be blinded by the sun for 12 hours of the day. Right? So actually, were they meant to be read, or was it just important that they were there? And what proportion of the population that walked in and out of this building were literate, or even if they were, did they care about a 200-year-old treaty with another city that that was no longer valid? All these things. I mean, to what degree were they actually meant to be read, and to what degree were they symbolic and meaningful for different reasons? And then we have as well as having to really care about the materiality of an object because that's the way they were made, we can also think about, and this probably isn't very visible because I don't have the Filosa disc in my hand, but this is a replica of it. We have an object like this. It has a text written on it, which presumably when it was written, someone was interested in reading, but we can't read it. So if we want to edit and make an edition of this object, we have to, I mean, I can make the screen a bit bigger. We have to, we can't say very much about the text. We can describe the paleography, we can describe individual symbols, but we can't really talk about what it says. We can't at all, unless someone's deciphered, linear A in the last few years, since I paid attention, but I might have noticed. But yes, so I think even inscriptions and papyri, there is a lot of, and there's a whole category of people, archaeologists who are interested in the object. Art historians, for example, because a lot of inscriptions are on monumental objects that look very nice in their own right. A lot of them don't, but there are some that do, that are on sculptures. Like the statue of Apollo over my right shoulder. That paper cutout doesn't show the whole thing, but the statue would have had a base underneath it, which would have had a dedicatory inscription on there. And so there are people who are really interested in that object and that monument who aren't going to read, who aren't as interested in reading the text as some of us might imagine everybody would be.
Votive offerings, for example, as well. I think there has been this tendency to study those objects by their main objective. So in the case of votive offerings, for that specific, to offer something to the gods, or if they were a sculptor for decoration or for its aesthetic value. But it's later on when we have realized that actually they bring in something else, and perhaps with digital humanities as well, the possibility to link together different sources of evidence and search across them. No, they are kind of facilitating this idea to create general standards that can allow us to search across many different types of evidence and resources. So, yeah.
And also to investigate like the relationship between the text and the object, because I mean that's also something that's very much compartmentalized. You know what I mean? So we should compartmentalize. So we shouldn't
just look at the text
only because it's a text, only because we're philologists, and we should ignore the rest of the object, which is a tendency as far as I can see in the disciplines I'm more familiar with. So yeah, also, I mean, definitely the digital humanities might help, just create also a something which is more broad, let's say, and more round, and you can see pretty much from every from every angle. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So it's also breaking boundaries in between disciplines, right? Because it's creating this kind of specialists that can like do research across disciplines, not just focusing on one thing, but being able to bring information or connect information across sources of evidence, disciplines, etc., which is really interesting.
Because disciplinary boundaries. Sorry, I thought you'd finished.
No.
Because disciplinary boundaries are artificial. They are almost entirely artificial.
Yeah.
You have a collection of 100 objects, which clearly all belong to the same place. They're all monuments in a graveyard, for example. They're all parts of the same building or whatever. 20 of them have writing inscribed on them, and therefore are published in one corpus. The other 70 are published in a different corpus. That is a completely artificial division, and we should bring those back together. We should never have broken them apart in the first place. And not just that where they're published, but where they actually are preserved. All of these beautiful statues, marble statues or bronze statues from the archaeological site, have all been moved into the museum. The inscriptions, some of them that the statues had to be sawn off of, okay, the bases underneath with the inscriptions on, are still out in the field, very close to where they were found, gradually getting worn away by the weather. I mean, it'll take hundreds of years, so that's not so much of a problem, but well, it's still a problem. But they're in a different place. They could be miles apart or thousands of miles apart. Some of the statues have been taken across the world to major museums. The inscriptions haven't, mostly because they're of a different kind of interest. They're not so pretty for display and so forth. So these we've created these really artificial divisions, as well as the disciplinary divisions.
Yes,
of who studies it.
Definitely. And what you say just rings a bell. Also, for example, how we present these things to the public. If you go to a museum, for example, you have very nice statues and very nice paint. Let's remain like in ancient and medieval times. So you have beautiful paintings and beautiful statues. And if you want to look at coins, which are, in my humble opinion, as interesting as statues, they are at the very corner, very small, badly lightened, and so on. So we should also like so I don't want to sound cheesy, but also break the boundary of nice and beautiful versus ugly. So because it's also what this kind of determines what gets passed on, both in terms of scholarship and in terms of materiality. So yeah.
I want to say one more thing before we move on maybe to some of the other points on your thing. We're still on point 1, as far as I can tell. And it is worth saying something about point 1. We've called point 1 metadata. And it's maybe worth saying what we mean by metadata. Metadata is a term normally meaning the data about your data, rather than data about the primary object of your study. So when we have a record of an inscription, that is to say the text, then that is the primary record. And then the metadata is, oh, by the way, this text was on an object that was 0.8 meters wide and was made of marble and is dated to the 2nd century CE and was excavated in 1970 and all this other kind of information, and is now in this museum and so forth. And the handwriting suggests that it's of a 2nd century hand. And all this sort of stuff that we say in there. The fact that we're calling that metadata is we're saying that the text is primary and everything else is less so, right? So metadata usually means, and this isn't the definition of metadata, this is my interpretation of what people mean when they say metadata. Metadata means that subset of the data that you have in your record that you don't think people are very interested in. Right? The data is what you're showing people. The metadata is for the librarians. It's for the catalogers. We need it there, but it's not what the public want to see. And that's always based on an assumption. And that could be an assumption that the text is primary. That could be an assumption that the audience aren't interested in some of the sort of obscure information that we're going to talk about in a minute, things like process, things like provenance, things like intellectual property, permissions, standards that we use, all of those things. We assume that the public aren't interested in those, and therefore they're metadata rather than data. And I think we always have to question that assumption.
Definitely. I mean, we just talk about it, not even thinking what we're saying. So that's
and
great.
every day when people come to museums, they want to know more about the object and what is shown in the label most of the times, right? So where it
I think you can really interest people in metadata. I mean, metadata in a library context, it's a word from the library world. And what metadata means is the data in your catalog record is, this is the book, this is its title, this is where it was published, this is how many pages it has. The metadata is who cataloged it, where did we buy it, how much did it cost, right? So that's not information about the book, that's information about the library catalog on the book. And it's clear that sort of division. Some of those things the audience, the reader might be interested in, but the users of a library catalog are probably not interested in which librarian catalogued this object, unless it's a historical information about which librarian catalogued something in the 18th century. That might become of interest. But in a museum catalogue, that's like, and we're going to talk about this in a few weeks, aren't we, Paola?
We will be discussing.
But it's slightly different, because there are things, who wrote this caption on the object, who wrote the description card, that then does become of interest, potentially. So it's a bit, there's a bit more of an assumption as to what's of interest and not. And when we're talking about, as I say, an epigraphic edition, calling all the non-textual apparatus on the edition metadata is telling. So that's quite interesting. I think the next two bullet points are sort of the same thing. Paradata is a term that was used, that was coined 10 or 15 years ago to talk about the description of the digitization process. And other people have sort of rejected that term and saying it's just a type of metadata. It's the metadata of the process. So you could call that processual metadata or procedural metadata. I have no objection to calling it paradata, as long as we know what we mean, if it becomes a useful term of art. But in any case, that's the data, the metadata about the digitization at that point. And digitization is not a neutral process. It's not just taking a photograph of an object and saying, well, that's happened. And I say not just taking a photograph because, as we all know, photographers are artists. Every photograph is an interpretation of the object, an interpretation by the photographer, an interpretation by the designer of the hardware, an interpretation by the history of photographic film that captures certain surfaces better than others. So all of that is still part of the process that is worth recording. But a digitization is even more so. When you digitize an inscription, and in the way that the first Ian and Martina described various aspects of earlier, you're making a decision about the transcription. You're making a decision about the description. You're interpreting the material in some way, and that may be unambiguous. You say it's marble, but if I say it's blue-veined Greek marble, that then becomes a certain amount of interpretation in there. And what do I mean? The date is an interpretation. All of these things are interpretive. And the photographing, the digitization, if you make a 3D model, all of these are things that that both the technician and the software have, and the hardware have had an impact on and have made a process on. So if I make a 3D model using one particular model of laser scanner as opposed to a different model of structured light scanner, it's important to tell you what scanner I used and what settings I used, so you know how to interpret that model. Did I run any kind of process on that prettified it afterwards? Did I clean up errors? Did I restore things? So paradata is the equivalent of having an apparatus criticus on your text. It's saying what decisions you've made. Having a text with an edition with no paradata is like having a textual edition with not only no apparatus criticus but also no brackets. So you can't tell what's visible and what I've just made up. Any other thoughts about that?
I can just think of, talk from experience. So now, as you know, in the framework of our project, we're digitizing seals with the RTI dome, and it is crucial to say how we're doing that, with which software, with the help of whom, because we're working also with someone in Pisa who is writing the script that we're running then. So if we do not say that in 10 years, but also before, we will just mislead people, and I'm just exaggerating right now, so that we could lead people to think that the seal just lights up itself, just in natural form. Do you know what I mean? Of course, it's an exaggeration, and but if we do not say this reproduction has been achieved using this software, using this hardware, and done by this person, it's misleading, and it's not good scholarly practice. So, and we're all scholars, so we should know better.
Another question I have is, I'm curious, as if in your field, like the text research and metadata and digitization of text, have you noticed that it's more difficult to see, for example, the photos or the digitized files attributed to the people that created them, whereas in other projects, like for material practices or oral histories or memories, much more common to see the person that digitized the process or the practice or whatever, because they are perhaps recording them, creating videos or something more complex than just taking pictures or scanning text. Because I see sometimes it's not so easy to find the person that actually did the scan or the photo, as if they were like kind of ignore or bypass, because the most important bit is the digitized element, the surrogate, or however we want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're not always as good at as we would hope to be, and this is partly about giving people fair credit, but it is partly part of that paradata, isn't it? It makes a difference who the photographer was. It makes a difference who the artist was who drew a sketch of our object. It makes a difference what instructions they were given. Make a sketch that makes it really easy for the viewers to be able to see it, or make a sketch that's really pretty. Those are two different skills. Two different people might be better for doing those sorts of things. It's also about, I think, intellectual property, which is one of the items on our list, is one of the reasons why we're not always as good at this as we might be. If we've hired someone to take a bunch of photographs for us, then the photographs are work for hire, and in theory, or at least it might be the case, that they belong to the project. That they are the intellectual property of the project, and therefore we're not obliged to credit the photographer, which is both unfair, I think deeply unfair and unethical, I would say, although it's completely legal and normalized. But it's also then, as you say, potentially misleading, because there's information missing about the process. And that I think is important, because we then lose information about what camera was used, what lighting was used, and all these other things. So yes, I think we often do lose that sort of information. I mean, we're supposed to, when we publish something, have a caption saying, who took the photograph, but very often we instead just say whose copyright is that photograph, and how many pictures have we seen that say copyright the British Museum?
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than photographer was person X.
Yeah.
Or the British Museum Photography Department, or I'm sorry, I don't want to pick on your institution, but that's every institution does that.
Yeah, and I think the problem is sometimes it's so normalized that there is not even a space to credit the person. You cannot even record that sort of metadata if we want to consider it metadata, because it's the person taking the picture. And it's so key, because even if you have a bit more information of what the person expertise was, you can perhaps identify why the person is focusing on one aspect or others of the piece that they are digitizing, because that's their expertise or what they want to see more. So yeah, definitely.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say this also relates quite nicely to the issues of transparency. because if you are like hiding the name of the person who is in charge, let's say, of the digitization of the object or of the text or wherever, you're lacking transparency too. So it's just so it kind of touches upon everything that we have on this list pretty much.
Yeah. I did want to just note to remind the people watching this live on YouTube, people watching in the future. I'm glad you're watching, but unfortunately we can't get live comments from you. But those who are watching live, please do leave comments. You've got a live chat. You see a couple of people said hi at the beginning of the session, but please do comment on any of the things we're talking about or haven't talked about yet in there, or if you have any questions for any of us, please do so. We'll see that and we'll address that. Maybe in the interests of sort of speeding this up, I might just quickly race through with a couple of definitions of the rest of the things we've talked about, and then you guys can jump in and sort of stop me if you want to add a bit more to them. So I think the reason we put provenance on that list is that there's an importance in the provenance of an object, not only in terms of the common things that you do get in ethnographic edition. Where was this found, in what excavation context, and what major institutions has it belonged to in the meantime, and where is it likely to be now if you wanted to see it, or where was it last seen if we don't necessarily know where it is now or if it's lost. But also provenance in the sense of, how did the museum acquire this? Was it as part of an excavation thing? Was it a government contract? Was it acquired on the private market? Is it something that's been trafficked? If it's something from 100 or 200 years ago, then it wouldn't have been called trafficked, but ethically, effectively was quite often. A lot of things in Western, European and Northern Hemisphere museums are effectively pillaged during the colonial period. So there's all that question of provenance. There's also provenance of the edition itself. Where has my edition come from? What other editions is it based on? Am I the first person to have seen this and described this, or has it come elsewhere? How did this object come before me? And this relates to permissions and private collections and so forth. Because there's a very long-standing tradition in certainly in classics, and as I understand in medieval studies as well, and I suspect in all disciplines, of the archaeological authorities or the institution that holds the object saying, we want someone to publish the texts on these objects or publish descriptions of the objects, because this is true of non-text bearing objects as well. And so I'm going to ask my friend, Professor so-and-so, who's an expert on this particular kind of text, to publish them for us. And while these objects are visible, they may still be on the archaeological site, and tourists may see them and photograph them, and there may be pictures of them, that you can find on Google. They may be in a museum where members of the public can come and see them, or where, even if they're not on display, so any scholar or researcher can request to see them. But it is generally assumed and understood that no one is allowed to, and no one would have the indecency to publish the object or its text before scholar so-and-so, who was given permission to do so, has done so, because he or she is the one who's supposed to do it. And scholar so-and-so may do so relatively quickly, in 2 or 3 years. If they do so in less than 10 years, let's say that's relatively quickly. Or 50 years later, they may still have them sort of, conveniently ready for when they desperately need a publication. They can put a few more of them out. And if a junior scholar were to say, actually, I'm just going to publish this because I can't be asked to wait any longer for this to appear, and it's really important that scholarship, is able to start citing and discussing this, they could end up actually having career damage by that, because they could be penalised by friends of scholar so-and-so, or just other scholars who also have things reserved to them that they don't want precedent to be set of people ignoring these reservations and reserved permissions. And that's important to record as data. I mean, that's a problem for our discipline, because while it may not seem very urgent on a global scale, that an inscription that's been buried in the sand takes 50 years to publish after it's found. That is a bit of a problem for those of us who are historians who care about what might come out of that. And I think some of us are a bit pissed off about that. So it is important to say where the permissions to publish this came from, and how long have they been sat on, and did scholar so and so give me permission to publish it because they knew they were never going to get around to it, or did the museum just say fine, it's you can always do it. So that's something we ought to talk about. And intellectual property is related to that. Who actually owns the intellectual property of an ancient object or the text on an ancient object? Legally speaking, that's usually nobody, because copyright expires somewhere between 70 and 100 years after the death of the author, and so it has expired. That's not always the case. If the object in question is from Egypt or Greece, which large numbers of such objects are, then the copyright on heritage objects remains with the government, with the state, and so it's not in the public domain as it would be in most other places. So those are things we're talking. But there's also not just legal, but there's the ethical component to what is intellectual property. Whose heritage am I publishing? And am I part of the culture that pillaged that heritage historically from the culture whose heritage it is? And those are things that are worth addressing in metadata and paradata. Those are the main things. Transparency, I think, is the question. Transparency of standards is just the question of saying this is published. As well as all of the other information, but this is published using EpiDoc, and saying what EpiDoc is and how you could go and learn more about EpiDoc if you want to know more about the standards that this is based on. And that's something that's quite important if someone wants to be able to process or use your digital files that are behind this edition. So that's another level of metadata. And we talked about languages and translations because there is more and more the assumption that English is the language of scholarship, and we probably ought to be. I mean, obviously, given my co-presenters in this session, I should say there's no reason why you shouldn't publish this edition in German or Italian or Spanish, or French, I should say, for my own country people. But the other major languages of European scholarship. But if you're working on inscriptions from, as I do, from the ancient world, part of the ancient world that is now in the territory of Libya, and you don't publish your results in a way that can be read by people whose first language and possibly only language is Arabic, then what the hell are you doing? I mean, how do you who do you think you're speaking to? And do you actually think that the people whose heritage this is, don't give a shit about what you're publishing? I mean, that's so short-sighted. So there's a lot of this question of what languages should we be using? And there's we can do much better with languages now, even though many more people are monoglot nowadays than we used to be able to get away with. We have machine-assisted translation, which can help us with this sort of thing, and we can hire translators and all sorts of reasons, and so much of what we do is collaborative, right? I mean, I can't imagine doing a project like this that wasn't an international collaboration. So if the three of us were doing a collaboration, we'd have it in 5 languages already, right? And if Usama was here, we'd add Arabic to that. So we need to think about, these are things we need to think about when we're making editions.
Yeah, and if I may add a small thing, in the framework of the Digibit Seal project now in Cologne and Paris, when we're dealing with, of course, Byzantine seals, but for 2 of the collections, we're dealing actually with Byzantine seals from Carthage, and from Tunisia, and Byzantine seals found in Bulgaria. And we just last week we created a spreadsheet in order to translate all fields and all content also into Bulgarian and so on, in order to to make this resource available also to people not speaking English or German, which is not we shouldn't take into account that everyone worldwide has to know English or has to know German or French. So that's, and it also kind of gives accountability to like not accountability, so it kind of gives praise, if I can say so, to the heritage that these artifacts come from, which is not a little thing.
Yeah.
Even though the people who did these objects kind of died more than 1,000 years ago, but still.
No, yeah, I completely agree. I just had 2 points quickly. The transparency of standards, just to emphasize how important it is, not just to define the standard you are using and describe it and justify why you're using it because you think it's the best for your specific data, but also for people to be able, as Gabi said, to reuse your information and merge it with the information they already have. So specifying the standard, describing it, and justifying and documenting it is key. I mean, in my perspective, for any digital or any data-based project, which is mostly any project, even if it's your own little customized, tailor-made like standard that you are creating, just justifying and documenting it is adding so much information to the
especially
project.
if it's a small, customized, made-up standard.
Especially, yeah.
Because
exactly.
you can't Google it and find out what it is otherwise.
Yeah. And it brings so much value to the whole data set that you are generating.
Yeah.
Right? And the queries and the results overall, and completely agree with the idea of multilingual metadata and multilingual databases, like being able to enable people to search for these resources in their mother tongue or in their language, especially when they are from the place that they are, right, from the same place. Like, it's fundamental for us as well. Also, the possibility to capture the community, in my perspective, because I work with living communities, the community knowledge and the community traditions in their own languages, with many of the times we cannot even be able to represent with English or any language that we use. There is also this sort of like, you lose information trying to translate some of the traditions. So how can we actually enable other languages and perhaps even create vocabularies or authorities where we explain those terms and use them in the English collection of data, so to sort of also educate, right, people that want to learn more about the tradition or the knowledge recorded. That's key, and I think it's going to be a really important field of research in the coming years in terms of databases and data recording and data modeling.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the multilingual feature is even more important for living communities, as you said, because you work with living communities. And in our case, so Gabby's and mine's, if I can speak on your behalf, so it's not just it's not actually living community. I mean, the living communities are the ones who should also be made into the position of being users of what we are producing. So this is kind of our relationship to living communities right now, because they are the ones pretty much providing the artifacts, and they should also be able to benefit also from a scholarly point of view. So
and also to generate that engagement and right connection with them. Otherwise,
of course.
Yeah, I mean, we now tend to roll our eyes a little bit at those projects and those sort of scholarly contexts that insist on publishing editions of classical texts and materials with the commentary and metadata in Latin. And we think, do they think this is the 19th century? But there was one advantage to that, which was, in the 19th century, everybody's second language, or every scholar's second language, was Latin, and there was a level playing field because it was also nobody's first language. Whereas now, if we're doing all that in English instead of in Latin, people who are from anywhere. I mean, even in Europe, right? The relatively privileged Europe, who's outside, let's say, UK, France, Italy, Germany, and to a lesser extent, but also Spain. If they write in their own language, no one else is going to read it. You know, articles in Dutch are very, very seldom read outside of the Dutch-speaking world, and articles in Bulgarian or Serbian or even Greek, despite the fact that we're classicists and often Philhellenists, you know, there's these things will very, very often not get seen, and in Latin now wouldn't either, because who wants to read articles in Latin? But there isn't any level playing field because okay, you can say everyone can learn English and that can become the new Latin, but those of us whose native language is English then have this massive advantage. We can write much more quickly, we can write much more fluently, all sorts of, you know, I say more quickly and more fluently, but both of you write at least as fluently as I do, but it's you know, it is a it's not as simple as just saying, well, you know, everyone used to use Latin, now everyone uses English, and how it's not really any different, because it is different.
Or it, for example, English caters right now to like the whole panorama, let's say, the whole landscape of all disciplines, all sub-disciplines, everything from math to Byzantine sigillography in the 11th century middle, let's say. Whereas there are, and I can speak only from my let's say experience, there are, for example, still a very thriving, part of scholarship writing in Greek, writing in in Bulgarian, but it caters to such a small niche of very, very specific topic, where I always used to joke during my master's, and I would say, if for this thing that I'm writing, which was very specific, I need to read an article in Georgian, I will do so without knowing any Georgian, because there's a thriving community about, for example, manuscript in this particular area, which you can't read if you don't know how to read a specific language. So it's still out there, but of course it's an underdog. I mean, there's no, we can't deny it. So everything is going to be like bulldozed by English and by other languages.
I think you're absolutely right. It's a problem for us as well. We can no longer read things in, that are written by Croatian and Georgian and whatever scholars, because unless they decide to write in English, so we're losing that as well as them losing an audience. There's another element to this, which the last thing I want to say on languages. There's another element to this, which was equally and possibly even more a problem when Latin was the lingua franca, which is that who are we speaking to? Are we really only speaking to highly educated scholars who know Latin and therefore can read in Latin? Yes, it can be people from any country, but do we really think that scholarship about the ancient world is only of interest to highly educated scholars? And I don't think it is. I don't think it should be. And so even now we might say, okay, most scholars, not all, but most scholars from any of these countries, especially the countries that have relatively minor languages, less widely spoken languages. They're not minor in any other sense. Most of those scholars will have learned enough English to be able to read articles in English, because they miss out on so much otherwise. But in many parts of the world, in Germany, large parts of the population will speak a little English, and in parts of the world with very heavy tourist industries, maybe people will speak a lot of English, which wasn't the case for Latin. But in many parts of the world, that people don't. In most of North Africa, there's very little English spoken by the non-academic and non elite populations. And do we really not want to speak to those audiences? I think we do. We should.
And we should. I mean,
I do. I want to. Not everyone does, but yeah, I think that the fact that we're not always working as hard as we should to make sure our output is accessible to those audiences does suggest that we're not doing as good as we should. So to get back to that slide, remind us some of the other points other than language.
That's very triggering, languages.
Yeah. Is there anything to say about permissions? Anything more to add?
Not.
So, I mean, one aspect of that I know you've said things about in the past, Martina, is things in private collections. You know, who owns these objects? Who has access to these objects?
And there's in that part of like the jurisdiction, the jurisprudence is very it's very gray. Let's say it's a very gray area, and you heavily depend on the person owning the collection and on his or her generosity. As you know, we're very, very lucky at our department to work with Robert Feind, who has the biggest collection of Byzantine seals in Germany, and he's one of the kindest, most generous people ever. And now he's also a student in Byzantine studies because he wanted, to learn. He does something completely different as his day job, let's say, but he wanted, to learn more about everything. So he's doing his bachelor's right now in Cologne, but it's not always like that. And also as I was saying, the laws in Germany at least are very gray in that respect. But also going back 1 second to permissions and to copyright and to intellectual property, I followed a seminar a couple of weeks ago about this, so about, let's say, also Creative Commons licenses and so on and so forth. And there's also a very gray area for our let's say topics, because copyright doesn't apply, but then who has the right of publishing what? Who has the right of having those? Of taking pictures? So let's start from the very beginning. So do I have the right of taking a picture of an artifact which is, I don't know, in this and that library, in this and that town of Germany? And then do I have the right to publish it? So it's a very interesting thing that should be explored, but not by us. I mean, I do not have the qualifications to do so. And there should be like more regulations, and of course regulations in our case should be all in favor of disseminating the knowledge and to make it public. So not only to disseminate, but really to make it public, to make people aware of things that otherwise will still, English or Latin, they will remain confined to a very small elite of a niche of person. Yeah, sorry. That's what I want to say about permissions. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and there's a practical side to that as well. I mean, as you say, the legal situation can sometimes be grey, but in some cases, the legal situation actually isn't what matters, because it's not that anyone's going to sue me, and it's certainly not that I'm going to sue anyone under any circumstances, even if they're denying me access to something which legally I should have. There's no way that's going to happen. Yeah. But what happens in practice, if I'm working on a body of texts which are inscribed on objects that are on an archaeological site in, let's say, a Mediterranean country, and it could be almost any such Mediterranean country, and I get therefore a work permit as part of that excavation, and I go there, I'm allowed to take therefore photographs for certain purposes. If I go visit that archaeological site without that permit, but as part of the excavation, I'm not allowed to take photographs, and I'm not allowed to publish those photographs, and I've signed something when I entered the site saying I'm not going to do so and whatever. And so, it becomes really difficult for me to do that. A tourist might be taken around the site, and they're allowed to take any photographs they like. So if I don't tell them that I'm interested in inscriptions, but I just pretend to be a tourist, I mean, I am a tourist, but I also just keep quiet about the thing. I can take any photographs I want. I can put them on, Flickr or Facebook or somewhere, and I can put them under a Creative Commons license. And then, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't go to an archaeological site and pretend not to be in a bigraphist. But what I can do, if I want to publish a particular photograph of a given inscription, is I can have a look on Flickr and see if someone a tourist has taken a photograph of that and put it up there under Creative Commons license, which is completely legal, and therefore I can reuse it, give attribution to the photographer, and I might have to crop the picture because it's they've got a picture of them with their fiance in front of the inscription. That's not the bit I'm interested in, and the inscription was just there by accident. But I've got a photograph of that inscription, and that sort of thing. That's. I mean, if I publish things that are not based on photographs that I or members of my team have taken, that's usually where I've got them from. Now I don't normally have to crop someone's fiance out of them, but it's that sort of thing. It's I mean, I have found pictures where really useful pictures showing the context of a monument, but the photographer was taking a photograph of a camel, and the monument just happened to be there. So it's you sometimes have to work around these things. But in the context of this seminar, which I note finished a minute ago, we should be clear in our editions where we got these images from and why, and what we think the legal basis of this is, and the academic niceties of this are, and so forth. That's something we need to be quite careful about. I mean, I've seen, for example, on the current epigraphy site, which is a blog with news about inscriptions, people have reposted a press release from a newspaper, which the archaeologists made an announcement. The newspaper picked it up, and they included a photograph of this inscription with just some words underneath. Someone reposted that to the current epigraphy blog, and then the archaeologists got angry because you're publishing something without permission. You're publishing an inscription that hasn't yet been published by the person to whom permission was given. It was okay for a newspaper to do it because you assume that the readers of the newspaper can't read the Greek on the inscription. Publishing it on the current epigraphy blog, it's being looked at by epigraphers, and therefore it's assumed that this is this is breaking that academic nicety, and that we shouldn't be doing this. No, it's not a legal thing. We haven't broken any laws.
No.
But it's something that does people do get upset about, and it's so being clear about that sort of thing. I mean, obviously it's difficult to do so because sometimes we try to keep quiet about this sort of thing just so we don't piss people off. But I think it is academically important to be really transparent about what we're doing and where we're getting this stuff from and on what basis we're publishing it.
Definitely. And it's more a question of ethics and of tact than of law.
Yeah. So I think we should probably stop there. Next week we'll be coming back to this question a lot. There'll be in the discussion we'll be talking again about things like copyright and what photographs we're allowed to republish and not, and on what basis, because we'll be talking about using and editing Wikipedia next week. So please do join us for that, and I hope you'll take part in the exercise. There's also we didn't talk about today. There's at the bottom of the session page for this, which is on a GitHub wiki page, which you'll find the link to below the YouTube video. There's some readings, and at the very bottom of the page there's a proposed exercise for you to try out and put into practice some of the things we've talked about today, and in particular to then think about some of the issues. What things we've suggested you take an inscription that you you know something about, or that you find an online edition of, and try to describe that inscription's description and history in EpiDoc. And then which of the features that we talked about in the last section can you not figure out how you would say, but where you would put that in EpiDoc? And why, and what is missing, or what the information you want to capture just isn't in the published edition, and why is that? It's clearly important, but why do epigraphers not tend to publish that sort of information? So that's the exercise for you to think about if you'd like to work on that. Obviously, if you're doing this following this session as part of a class, you've been given instructions. So my students, for example, it's not if you feel like it, you have to do that exercise, and we'll discuss it next week. But anyone else in the world who watches this now or is watching this in the future, if you do try out that exercise and you'd like to talk about it more, or you'd like to think about it more, or ask more questions about it, please feel free to get in touch. We'd be delighted to hear from you. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. See you next week.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes.